podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Maxwell's House is brought to you by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is Maxwell's House with Ray Maxwell and Dr. Kiki, Episode 70, Flying Gliders versus Power Airplanes.
This episode of Maxwell's House is brought to you by Audible.com. For your free audiobook download, go to audiblepodcast.com/house. Welcome, everyone, to Maxwell's House. It's episode number 70 with Ray Maxwell and me, Dr. Kiki, sitting here in the studio, manning the cameras. We're talking today about flying gliders versus power. And Ray, you have so much on the docket for today. Give us a little idea of what you've got going on.
Well, we're going to have a quick look at the news and then cover the X-37 history, and which is a new space plane that is up in orbit. And then we're going to have a little update on the Tu-154, the Polish Tu-154. And then I'm going to go through a question and answer period. And then we're going to talk about my main topic, which is a lot of people ask me, well, Ray, what's it like flying gliders versus flying power? And those are the areas we're going to cover today.
Great. Yeah, I know that people have been asking those questions fairly regularly. Have you gotten tons of mail about that?
Yes. The aviation topic seems to be quite popular, and I've got a lot of notes and questions along those lines. So that's what we're going to do today.
Cool. Excellent. So first, aviation in the news.
That's right.
Yes.
And one of the big news stories today was that the U.S. Air Force had launched the X-37B. Now, let me give you some history on this program, because it's not a program that just sprung into existence yesterday. NASA started the project back in 1999, okay? So, that's, over 10 years ago. And Boeing had a contract to build a little space plane. When I say little, this thing is much smaller than the space shuttle. It's 29 feet long and 15-foot wingspan and weighs 11,000 pounds.
Whoa. But
in 2004, it was transferred from NASA to the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And it was drop tested from an aircraft in 2004. Mm-hmm. And then in 2006, the U.S. Air Force announced that it would develop the X-37B. Now, the original plan was the X-37, but it was on April 22nd, just this last week, it was placed in orbit for the first time. It is a military project, and it's classified as to what they have in mind. Now, you have to keep in mind, I think the timing of this is interesting because, as you know, the shuttle is winding down.
Yeah.
And is on some of its last flights. And I don't know whether you recall, but there were shuttle flights where the only news we got was this is a classified flight. And we didn't know what they did on that flight. Do you remember those? There weren't that many, but there were some that were just, yes, they can't hide the fact in Florida that the shuttle goes up. You can see it from half of the state. And
yeah, I don't remember classified missions.
Well, there were. Huh. There were classified missions where they just simply said this is a classified mission, and yes, the shuttle went up, and yes, the shuttle landed, and that's all you.
That's all you get.
That's all you get. And of course, we know that's winding down. So now here comes along this new vehicle, which was put into orbit last week, and it's interesting. It's unmanned, and it's it's basically a little autonomous vehicle, and it is designed to stay in orbit up to 270 days. So it kind of functions both as a transfer vehicle and as a satellite itself. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens here. Now, I think one of the interesting responses kind of cryptically stuck in at the end of the story is Chinese sources have claimed that the X-37B flight might trigger an arms race in space. Ooh. Yeah. What, maybe they know more what's intended with it than we do. I don't know. But that is one of the question marks that's out there is this going to be used as a weapons platform or to service military satellites or whatever? And, of course, no one's saying. But it is interesting that it goes into orbit just as the shuttle is winding down. So
right. Yeah.
Time will tell.
As it always does.
Yes, and if you scroll down on that web page, you'll find a picture of it after it's landed, and you get an idea. It's a fairly small device.
Yeah, it looks smaller than the current space shuttle.
It's less than a quarter of the size.
Yeah, but it has a similar shape in terms of the front kind of plane-like nose cone and small stabilization wings, I would guess.
Right. Once again, remember that the shuttle and this ship are both gliders, but they don't have as good a glide ratio as the gliders I fly.
No, not quite.
but they do have a higher VNE. Now, VNE is velocity never exceed. In other words, this thing goes. It has Mach numbers attached to it. None of my gliders do.
Yeah, and is part of the shape of these glider space planes, does it have to do at all with going up into no atmosphere, going from atmosphere into no atmosphere, and then transitioning back and being able to maneuver?
Well, the critical phase is transitioning back, going from no atmosphere into the atmosphere, because you can skip off the atmosphere like a rock on a water, and of course re-entering the atmosphere, there's extremely high temperatures. Right. So both the shuttle and this share in common that they have a shape, and they have heat dissipating or heat insulating surfaces on the bottom of them to handle that extremely high temperature re-entry.
Got it.
So yeah.
It's fascinating. I can't wait to see what happens with it, and if it does, and what they end up using it for, because at some point they'll have to take it out and it'll become not classified so much. I would guess at some point. Okay, I'm making assumptions.
Yeah, I got to say, don't assume that, because keep in mind, this isn't a NASA project, and it's not a manned project. So we may hear that it got launched, and yes, it came back, and that's once again, like the classified shuttle missions, we may not hear much more.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it.
Now, another little clip that was in the news that they mentioned in the chat room is that there was a balloon that was carrying a very, very expensive instrument package that was going to be launched from Alice Springs, Australia. Anyway, they inflated the balloon and they didn't secure it properly, and the winds came up and started dragging it across the Alice Springs area, and the instrument package, which is worth millions, was smashed into an SUV.
Smashed into smithereens.
Right. Oh. And they deflated the balloon and got it under control, but it was a fiasco.
Yeah, this happens not regularly, but this does happen on occasion. I was talking with a science writer who went down to Antarctica and actually had some video of some researchers who were trying to corral this parachuted weather balloon. I don't know if it was a weather balloon, but it was like this parachuted instrumentation case that they were sending up into the atmosphere for research at the pole, and just went out of control and they're chasing after it and then it's chasing them. And it's, oh my goodness, I couldn't even imagine.
Well, when you get large pieces of fabric up in the air, I used to fly a hot air balloon, and I will do a show on hot air ballooning. But you have to be very careful because if any wind comes up, you've got thousands of pounds of force very quickly that you have to deal with.
Yeah,
So.
I grew up as a sailor, and I sailed J-24s as a junior racer, and I was foredeck. And I manned the spinnaker. And sometimes in heavy winds, when you're dealing with the spinnaker, it's a similar situation. And the spinnaker the sail will fill with wind and can get wobbling back and forth in front of the boat. And if there's enough wind, it just pulls the boat. And so the whole boat is being dragged through the water by the sail.
And never get your hand caught in the winch.
Oh, good. No, don't do it. Yeah. Take special care not to be wrapping the lines around your wrist.
That's right. Be careful tailing the winch because, boy, you can have a disaster there in half a second.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
What's going on with the Polish plane? You said you had an update with that one?
Yes, just a slight update on that. I actually found on the web a picture. I didn't put the URL in here. But of the approach plate for that airport, and it's a rather unusual approach plate in that it's what we call a dual NDB approach. It has two non-directional beacons, and those are fairly easy to fly if you have what's called an RMI in your cockpit. And now, after years, I'm going to forget what the acronym, but any rate, it shows it's got two needles on it and shows you the direction from the plane of the two non-directional beacons. And that's the kind of approach they were flying. And the other information I got off of that approach plate is the second NDB. They're supposed to cross over it at an altitude of 230 feet, and by that time, they're supposed to see the runway. And from the recordings, I am told that you can tell that the pilot has looked up from his instruments. By the way, the most dangerous part of flying IFR is making the transition from looking at the instruments in the cockpit to looking out the window and picking up the runway. Now, usually the way that is done is the non-flying pilot looks out the window, and then he calls when he has the runway in sight. And the flying pilot, who is flying on instruments, usually does not attempt to look up and find the runway until he gets that call from the other pilot. When there's two pilots on board, that's the safest way to make that transition. With a single pilot IFR, they just glance up, and if they can't see it, they go right back down on the instruments and shoot a missed approach. But it apparently, from the recordings, it sounds like the guy, flying pilot, looks up and is desperately trying to find the runway. And the next thing you hear exclamations as they see trees and hit the ground. Yeah. So, and the other thing is the crash site is slightly off center line of this NDB approach. So that's the update on that. It's looking more and more like, yes, they flew below their minimum decision height. And they did. It's not uncommon for a pilot to look up and, he's just sure he's going to see the runway.
Yeah. And then it's not there.
It's not there. And then he's not paying attention to the instruments, and then he doesn't realize till the last second that he's gotten too low. So So with that, we will move on to some questions and answers.
I know people have been waiting a while for the answers. These questions have been coming in, and you've been saying, we'll get to them next week. We'll get to them next week. So this is exciting. It's exciting question answer time.
Exactly. One of the questions, someone said, when I'm out flying on a commercial flight, oftentimes I notice, particularly if there's 2 or 3 major airports in a given area, that the airplane I'm in may pass directly overhead another major airport where it is not landing. Why on earth do they pass directly overhead a busy airport? And here in Vancouver, if you're in a small plane and you're flying up the coast and you want to go up the coast, the controlled airspace of the Vancouver International Airport occupies a large area. And if you want to go up north and cross through that airspace, quite often they'll ask you to pass directly over the center of the airport. And it's fairly simple why that is the safest place to do it. Since aircraft do not take off straight up and straight down, but take off and they climb at about a 7-degree angle when they climb out, a jet will, and they come in at about a 3-degree angle. So if you draw lines from the ends of the runways up at those angles, there's this area in the middle directly over the airport where there are no aircraft. So that's the safest place to run other aircraft, especially at right angles to the runways that are in use. That's the safe place to have aircraft pass over that airport. If you're either side of that, then you're likely to encounter, and of course air traffic won't let you go into those areas, but you could encounter the takeoff path or the landing path of the aircraft. So that explains why quite often you will see other aircraft passing directly over the center of the airport, usually at approximate right angles to the traffic that's taking off and landing. So that's where that one is. Now, another person wrote in because I told a story about the F-4 Phantom last week and getting a Marine pilot in trouble because he used full afterburner takeoff. And he says, okay, what's an afterburner? So first of all, a normal jet turbine engine is exactly that. It has a turbine. So there are fan blades or compressor blades at the front of the jet engine that compress the air that are coming in the air intakes. And then that air is taken into what's called the combustion area, and fuel is ignited and burns in that combustion area in the presence of this compressed air. And of course, the burning fuel is an expanding gas that increases the pressure in that part of the engine. And then it goes through a second set of turbine blades that are actually connected back to the compressor blades. And then the air goes out the exhaust and produces the thrust of a turbojet engine. Now, if you have a prop jet, all they do is have another set of turbines in that stream that couple to that air that's going out the back, and a shaft goes up forward and turns a propeller. So you can take additional energy out of it. So there's turboprop, there's a turbine, and then finally, I'm going to talk about a very special kind of jet engine, which is called a ramjet.
I love ramjets.
Roger, ramjet.
I love it.
Ramjets can only be started in the air. If you make a model of one or something, it has to be going several hundred miles an hour before it will work. You can't start a ramjet on the ground and take off.
Yeah, scientists trying to build these, they have to launch another plane or a rocket that then the ramjet will be able to take off from or be launched from. Right.
But it's simply a specially shaped cylinder that's somewhat tuned to the resonance of the combustion, and they simply shoot fuel into this specially shaped tube. And the air coming in the front will not let the air go back out that way, and it explodes and expands and shoots out the back of the jet. Now,
basically ramming the air.
Right. A afterburner is simply a ramjet stuck on the back of a turbine jet. In other words, it's a second area where they introduce fuel, and it increased the thrust of the engine. But again, you can only fire it up when you have the other engine up at full throttle, so that there's this high compressed air coming into the ramjet part of the engine. And when they do that and combine these two, that aft ramjet is called an afterburner, and it increases your thrust. By the way, it increases your fuel burn horrendously.
Yeah, you use a lot more fuel.
You don't leave the afterburner on for very long. You only use it in very short bursts, in a fighter aircraft so that you can get away from your enemy in a hurry or what have you. the other area that was asked in connection with that is someone said, well, and again, last week I told a story about an F-4 Phantom on a test flight that had to land and could only apply its brakes once. And I mentioned that to slow it down, it used the drogue chute, and then it applied and held the brakes, the tires would burst, and then it would grind to a halt on the hubs of the wheels. And someone said, well, why didn't they use reverse thrust? And it's very simple. Phantom aircraft do not have reverse thrust. By and large, on fighter aircraft, it's very rare that they have reverse thrust. I guess they assume that they have the air bases with long enough runways, they don't need it. Plus, it's a complication in the engine. But you do see reverse thrusters, which are simply cups or mechanisms that capture the air coming out of the back of a jet engine and deflect it forward such that you can deflect the thrust in the opposite direction it normally goes. And one of these days, I'll go through an accident that was caused by the way reverse thrusters are activated and the safety mechanisms in place. Because the only time you ever want reverse thrust to happen is when the wheels of the aircraft are on the ground and you're landing and you're trying to stop. So Phantoms don't have reverse thrust. There's very few fighter aircraft that have it. It's very common on almost all commercial aircraft. So maybe at this time we should take a quick pause to acknowledge our wonderful sponsor.
Audible.com. That's right. This hour of Maxwell's House is brought to you by the sponsors, Audible.com. And they are the leading provider of, we've been saying 60,000, but it turns out over 75,000 different titles and numbers of genres ranging from science to science fiction to aviation to biographies to fiction, whatever you want. Audible probably has something for you in a downloadable format so you can consume it whenever you want. You can read a book, listen to it in your car while you're at the gym, or, while you're just wandering around in the park or at the local airfield checking out the planes. So Ray has a pick of the week for you, and as usual, it's a very special choice made by Ray for you.
All right.
What is it, Ray?
Well, I'm into Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, which is a collection of stories and data this time about people who are successful and some of the common reasons we think people are successful. And then he shows and demonstrates that a lot of times there are other factors that we never dreamed of. I'll give you one quick example in Outliers in the opening chapter. A fellow, not Malcolm, but a fellow he's writing about is at a hockey game, a championship hockey game here in Canada with his wife. And his wife suddenly notices that all of the championship players, their birthdays are in January, February, and March. And she shows this to her husband and said, why on earth is this? And so he did some research. And you say, oh, well, this is astrology or something. No, there's a very simple explanation. In Canada, when kids are 8 or 9, 10 years old and they get into hockey, the cutoff date for their age is January 1st.
Right.
And so the kids that have just turned, 10 years old or what have you, are 11 or 12, 6 months older than the other kids that are on the team. And so consequently, they have a big size and coordination advantage. And unfortunately, the Canadian hockey system, the junior hockey and stuff, starts sorting the kids out. And those kids that are doing well, they get more ice time, they get the better coaches, they get more equipment, etc. And so from that early separation, because of that small age difference, the effect is magnified by the privileges that they get.
Right, and the years of those privileges that they get. That's amazing. Right. So Malcolm Gladwell is looking at the numbers and comparing
Yes.
and comparing it to what's happening in the world
Mm-hmm.
and telling you those stories.
Yeah.
So for anybody who wants to download Outliers from audible.com, you can get a free audiobook download if you try out Audible. If you sign up today, when you go to the website address, audiblepodcast.com/house, that's audiblepodcast/house, you will get one free audiobook download for signing up. That's a thanks from audible.com, our sponsors for today's Maxwell's House. So,
Indeed.
yeah.
And by the way, just as another teaser on Outliers, there's also the reasons he believes that Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and many of the techies, why they succeeded, where others who were perhaps just as high in IQ and so forth did not. So it's a good read, good listen.
It sounds like it. I've only heard good things about that book. So,
Yes.
and I think it also teaches the lesson that your assumptions are not always correct, and that we have this brain that fits things to patterns and
Yes.
makes these patterns come clear that aren't right all the time. That
That's right.
our brain lies to us.
We are very, from primitive times, we are pattern seekers. And sometimes that gets us in trouble. And that's why we had to invent science.
Science.
To make sure we weren't lying to ourselves or jumping to conclusions. And someday I'll talk about Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, which I
good.
disagree with some of his assumptions.
And that's okay. It just makes for good conversation, right?
Right. But it was an interesting read regardless. Yeah.
Yes.
Now let's go back to our questions. I'll just wrap a few of them up. Another fellow wrote in and says, does anybody still build biplanes? And if so, what are they used for today? And in fact, there are a number of airplanes, but they're for very, very special use. And usually it's air show aerobatics. And even the competitive aerobatics in power now have gone to single wing or monoplane designs. But there still are some of the top air show routines done with those. And the planes that are still built are the Pitt Special, the Kristen Eagle, and then Sean D. Tucker, who's probably one of the foremost air show performers, flies a Challenger 2, which is a very highly, highly modified ship that I think is still, once upon a time, way back when, was a Pitt Special. Or he started with a Pitt Special, but this was built special for him. It's not a derivative of the Pitts. And but it can do things that no other aircraft in the sky can do. But it is optimized for aerobatics and for doing the particular routines that he does. It's not optimized as a cross-country airplane or load-carrying airplane or anything like that. And then the final question I'll touch on today is a fan wrote in and said, why on earth are aircraft radios still amplitude modulated? They're AM, and almost all other two-way communications, flight, dispatching and everything else is FM. And it's a real simple answer. It's just history. Real early on, that was what the radios were. The really early ones were HF radios in aircraft, and they were AM. And then VHF came along, and the early VHF were AM, and the aircraft has just never gotten away from that. There's no other reason. There are many reasons why FM would be better, but to change all the aircraft in the world and all of the ground air traffic control radios, to change them all at once would be a horrendous job, and they just don't do it. Also, they're not very powerful radios. They don't have to be, because if you're up at 30,000 feet, you can talk 300 miles on a 5-watt radio. So they don't have to be extremely powerful or anything, and the demands on them aren't that high.
And is that because, just this is a tangent, but is that because of the less atmosphere getting in the way of the radio waves, or just fewer radio waves at that altitude?
It's just that VHF radios are line of sight.
Okay.
And so if the more altitude you have, the further out you can talk, but it doesn't take much power.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. Now we're going to get to the main topic. Many people have written in and asked me, said, you fly gliders, you fly power. Tell us, what's the difference? Is one harder than the other? And first of all, let me just say that the aircraft are optimized in very different ways. Small power aircraft are optimized to be easy to fly and to cruise efficiently. And today they're almost all tricycle gear, and they have chosen wing shapes that have benign or docile stall characteristics, and they do a reasonable job at their cruising speed. So that's power aircraft, small power aircraft I'm talking about, that most people fly. And then the glider, on the other hand, is optimized to fly very efficiently at low airspeeds with a minimum sink rate and the best lift-to-drag ratio. Now, let's back up the truck and work our way through those.
Cool.
Yeah. First of all, the wings are laminar flow wings, which are very low-drag wings, but they're designed to produce a fair bit of lift at low speeds like 35 to 50 knots, because that's where 45 to 55 knots is where most glider pilots spend most of their time flying. And then there's another regime from kind of 50 knots up to 80 or 90 knots where they're flying between thermals and cross country. So the aircraft are optimized to fly extremely well at those speeds, but those are low airspeeds as compared to the typical private aircraft, which is, cruising at 100 to 150 to 250 knots, depending on the model. So the two aircraft are optimized quite differently. Now, another thing I might mention, we mentioned sailing a moment ago. The gliders have these very long, what are called high aspect ratio wings. And you'll also notice that the very world's top sailboats now have very, very tall sails that aren't very wide.
Yeah.
Because they have learned that the leading edge of the curve of that airfoil is what creates the lift, and that having a big, long on the airplane, you'd call it a cord. On a sailboat, you'd call it the length of the sail. Having a big, long one really doesn't gain you anything. So sailplanes, gliders, soaring aircraft have these very long, thin wings. The typical single-place glider has a 15-meter wingspan. The two-place gliders are 17, 18, and 20 meters in wingspan. And then some of the open-class ships, the very highest performance, will have 25-meter wingspans. And these open-class ships now get glide ratios or lift-to-drag ratios of 60 to 1. Now, a typical high-performance glider today that I fly is between 35 and 50 to 1. The open-class ships, the very expensive, very high-performance ships, go up, like I say, to 60 to 1 today. And what those numbers mean is if you were 1 mile high and you're in a glider with 60 to 1 and there's no wind or there's no rising or falling air, you could glide 60 miles from 1 mile high. So from 5,000 feet up, you could glide 60 miles. Now, that's an incredible range that you can glide as compared to an aircraft when it loses an engine, because a typical Cessna has something between 10 to 15 to 1 glide ratio, depending on the model. So, when you lose the engine, yes, you can glide down safely, no problem. But it's going to be at quite a bit steeper angle.
Yeah, you're not the overall distance covered on the ground is really not going to be that far.
That's right.
You have to take care of what you need to take care of, get yourself settled fairly quickly.
Right. Find a nice field.
Yes.
Now, here's an interesting question along those lines about glide ratios that I often ask my students. I said, imagine that you have a 747 at 10,000 feet, and it flames out all 4 engines. And you have a Cessna 150 at 10,000 feet, and it loses its engine, and they're side by side.
Mm-hmm.
Which one glides further?
Which one has the higher lift-to-drag ratio?
Correct. It's the 747.
Right. Because it has
It-
a longer leading edge.
It has a higher efficiency wing and is optimized. However, the speed at which it glides and is optimal is much higher than the speed of the Cessna 150. So it will spend less time in the air and it will reach the ground sooner.
But it'll go further.
But it'll go further.
Got it.
Okay. And so you have to keep all those factors in mind. In other words, the pilots are busier and have to find that field and get that thing down quicker than the guy in the Cessna 150 is going to have a lot more time to pick out his field from 10,000 feet. He's going to have a considerable length of time. Now, let me point out that, again, when I fly a glider, most of our gliders have a sink rate in still air of about 200 feet a minute. So, it's going to take you 5 minutes to lose 1,000 feet. Whereas most light planes, you're going to be coming down at 500 to 700 feet per minute. So you have to, you don't have as much time to figure out what it is you're going to do. Now, the next thing I want to explain, that when an aircraft that has a very shallow glide angle like a glider, a lot of people say, well, you don't have any engine. How do you know that you're going to land safely at a given location? And it turns out that we have to deal with that in the glider, and we have a unique way of dealing with it. It turns out that the flatter the glide ratio, the more difficult it is. While you can go a long ways, it's very difficult to say precisely where you're going to land. The steeper the glide angle, the better you can predict down there on the ground where you're going to touch down.
Yeah.
So a Cessna, yeah, because you can see it. It's under your nose. Now, oftentimes in my glider, if I'm up at 10,000 feet, the visibility is such, even if it's 30 miles, I can't see the place I'm going to touch down. It's out of sight. So as I get close to the area where I'm going to land, I have something special in the glider, and they're called spoilers. And there are simply two panels that come out on top of the wings, and they spoil the lift. And they can reduce my glide angle from 35 or 45 to 1 down to somewhere around 15 or 10 to 1. So now I can come down at a steep angle. Now, I have a lever in the glider that I can open and close that panel that comes up on the wing. It's just some of them fold up vertically. Some of them come straight out of the wing vertically, but I have absolute control over that. So what I teach power pilots who are transitioning to a glider is I teach them to use the spoiler lever exactly the way they would use a throttle in an airplane. When you're coming in on approach in an airplane, you have this throttle, and if you push forward on the throttle, it increases your power and it shallows the glide angle. So you're going to go further before you touch down. If you want to steepen the glide angle, you pull the throttle back, take the power off, and it becomes steeper. Exactly the same thing happens with the spoiler lever. If you push the spoiler lever forward, it closes the spoilers, and that makes you glide further. If you pull the spoiler lever back, it's like pulling back on the throttle. It increases that drag, and it spills some of the lift on top of the wing, and you have to drop the nose and come down steeper to maintain the same airspeed. So you use spoilers to control exactly where you're going to touch down. So in fact, it makes it very easy to very precisely control where you're going to touch down in a glider. The only thing you have to remember is if anybody runs out onto the field or somebody encroaches on your runway, you can't go around in the glider.
Right. You're just going to be gliding down.
You are committed to, So then the next question that people ask me is they say, well, Ray, I hear about you going out gliding, and I hear you stay up all day in that glider. You're towed up by a power plane to typically 2,000 feet, and you're released, and then you climb much higher than that. How do you do that? And then, you stay up for 5 or 6 hours on a good day.
Yeah, how can you keep going?
How do you keep going? Well, the answer is lift. We look for rising air because remember, we're coming down 200 feet a minute. So we have to find air that's going up faster than 200 feet a minute. And by the way, if you measure that in knots, 200 feet a minute is approximately equal to 2 knots. Now, if you compare, you think about a 15-knot wind on the ground or what have you. If you're out sailing, a 15-knot wind is pretty brisk.
Yeah.
But sailing in a 2-knot wind,
turn on the motor.
Yeah. Okay. All we have to find is vertical motion of 2 knots to hold equal. If we get into 5 or 7 knots, which isn't unusual, we can climb 500 feet a minute.
Wow.
That's I took up one power pilot, and we were climbing up the side of this mountain, and we were in what's called ridge lift, which is just air going up the side of the mountain. Mm-hmm. And I was flying about one wingspan off of the trees, which made him a little nervous. You usually don't fly power planes that close to a mountain face. Yeah. At any rate, we're going up at 500 feet a minute, and he says, "Maxwell, you're in league with the devil." He said, "My Cessna 172 won't climb like this with full power." So, and by the way, if you learn to fly gliders, you can use those techniques when you're in the mountains for flying your power plane more efficiently. Yeah. And use some of the same techniques. You really get in touch in a glider with the surroundings, and you really tune into the clues.
And the airflow and how things affect your plane. I'm sure that not having an engine to rely on to power through situations, you really get to know what it feels like for pressure to change, for the wind speed to change, all those things.
Right. Now, another one they asked me is said, which is harder, flying gliders or flying power planes? And I'll just wrap this up in a nutshell. It takes more hours to learn to fly a power plane because you have to learn about engines. You have to learn about the avionics in it. It's a more complex aircraft. To get your private pilot license, you can get your private pilot license in less time in a glider, which means that you can take off, fly on tow, fly the circuit, come in and land. But to become an extremely high-quality, competitive soaring pilot that goes cross-country on 500 and 1,000-kilometer cross-countries takes years of practice because you have to expose yourself to many, many different kinds of flying conditions in a glider to know how to optimally fly in all those different conditions. And there's no way to learn that except do it for years and years and years.
Is there any part of that where you, during learning how to fly a powered plane, you just turn off the engines while you're flying on purpose?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. You practiced what are called simulated forced landings. And your instructor, when you least expect it, will reach over and gently close the throttle and say, forced landing. In other words, your engine just quit. What are you going to do? And you have to pick out a field and fly an approach to it. So, yes, you definitely have to know how to glide your aircraft down, pick a field from the air, preferably land into the wind so your landing speed is minimal. And absolutely, yeah. So anyway, what I'm saying is the basics of flying a power plane take longer to learn. To become a real expert, the dynamic range of skills required to be a top-notch competitive glider pilot actually takes many, many years. And we have many airline pilots that have tens of thousands of hours who come out and fly gliders because it's such a challenge. And they are some of our more competitive and experienced and skilled glider pilots. So, yeah.
And someone in the chat room found this site, the Soaring Society of America, not necessarily. Yes. Is this relevant to people in Canada like you, Ray?
Oh, yeah. We subscribe to their magazine. We work with them. We have our own national organization called SAC, S-A-C, Soaring Association of Canada. But we have a similar organization, and we work hand in glove with them and exchange lots of information. And we usually subscribe to each other's magazines and cooperate in every way that we can. And we fly together at various contests all the time. Canadians go down there and fly in the U.S. contests, U.S. pilots come up and fly with us here. It's a very collegial group of people, and we all really enjoy flying together and exchanging stories and whatnot. Now, it's showing there different kinds of lift. We do have ridge lift, which is the air going up the side of a mountain. We have thermals, which is often over a plowed field. The air will heat up, and then it will break loose and start flowing up, and it will form cumulus clouds above it. And those mark where the thermal lift is. And then finally, the ultimate died and gone to heaven lift is what we call mountain wave, which is in the lee of a mountain. And if you've ever watched in a river, you have a rock in the river and there's water going over the rock, and then downstream of the rock, there will often be a standing wave that is higher than the rock. And that's exactly what can happen in certain kinds of air. And that's where we get our highest flights here in Hope, BC. And we've had flights up to 18,000 feet from a 2,000-foot launch. So, and yes, we do wear oxygen when we go above 10,000 feet.
I would hope so. Even though you are gliding, but you do need to remain conscious.
That's absolutely true. There's no getting around it.
Is there the possibility that you can get stuck in a thermal and go way above 10,000 feet? If there's a thermal that'll just carry you up?
No, in a glider, there's no problem with that. You can fly out of it quite easily. Now, another day, I'll tell you about flying hot air balloons.
Oh, yes.
And the last thing you want on Earth is to get caught in a thermal in a hot air balloon, because thermals can go up faster than the terminal velocity of a balloon going down. So you do not fly hot air balloons when thermals are around. That's why you fly them early in the morning, late in the evening. Got it. Yeah.
These are good things to know.
Yes.
When not to accept a ride in a hot air balloon.
I had a friend of mine. I used to fly hot air balloons as well. And I had a friend of mine who was up in his balloon, not thinking, drifting along, and he went over a cooling tower of a thermal plant. And it was forming a thermal even in the morning. And he had a heck of a time getting out of it. He didn't get out till around 10,000 feet. And that really scared him.
That would be terrifying. I can just imagine suddenly you're just going up. Okay.
And the burner's turned off. And you're still going up.
Wow. Did you have more on the acrobatics of gliders, or are those going to be saved for another day?
Well, I'll just say briefly, that's the other advanced form of flying in gliders that I happen to have a special interest in. I'm one of 3 pilots who signed off to fly gliders in air shows. And that's all about learning to manage energy, potential and kinetic energy. Altitude is potential energy. Speed is kinetic energy. And when you do aerobatics in a glider, you don't have an engine. And so you have to continually trade off potential and kinetic energy. You have to dive down to pull up and do the loop. You lose that kinetic energy, and then you go back down. And all the time, you're working your way closer and closer to the ground. And there's one other big difference between doing power aerobatics and glider aerobatics, and that's as you get to the end of your last maneuver, which is very near the ground in the glider, you have to land.
At some point, yes.
Yeah. Power planes, you don't have to do that. You can just add throttle and fly away. But yes,
if you lose your kinetic and potential energy, then that's it.
You're going to visit with Mother Earth one way or the other.
I love the phrase, though, that gliding, I think that most people think of it as just a very not energy intensive kind of practice, but I love your statement that it is kinetic and potential energy management, and that you have to get good at that. And if you can't manage those 2 forms of energy, you're not going to do a good job of gliding. Or if you want to do acrobatics, you're going to do an awful job of that.
Right. You have to be very good at precisely managing those things when you get into glider aerobatics, because that's all you've got to work with to do your maneuvers.
Yep.
Yeah. Exactly. So next week,
Ooh.
I'm going to talk a little bit about early adventures when I was young in jumping out of airplanes.
Wow. I'm going to bring a little bucket. I've gone on, some of those rides at Great America or other theme parks where they drop you, they take you up and then they drop you, and that's as close as I ever want to get. So
while I was in college, I flew a plane for a group of parachutists, and of course they talked me into trying it out as well.
I am so interested in hearing about your experiences. This is as close as I will get.
Well, you should come up and fly gliders with me. You'd love it.
That would be fun. I think that could be a lot of fun.
We have one of the most beautiful locations on earth at Hope, BC. It's nestled in the mountains in a mountain valley, and we have 3,000 and 4,000 or 5,000 foot mountains all around us. Beautiful green trees and beautiful scenery and snow-capped mountains in the distance.
Sounds lovely.
Yeah.
Sounds wonderful. I will try and take you up on that offer. Go gliding in Canada. I love it.
Yeah.
So, Ray, where can people get in touch with you if they have more questions for you or ideas for shows?
They can write me at ray@twit.tv. So just ray@twit.tv. Send me your questions, suggestions, whatever you have on your mind. We are going to be focusing on aviation, although Leo told me on the phone the other day, he says, if you want to, from time to time, go off on a tangent, go ahead.
From time to time, I think it's okay.
Yeah.
I think that'll be fine. So, everybody, if you have not already done so, please subscribe to the Ray to Maxwell House in iTunes. It's available as a podcast. It's also available in YouTube in video format. So if your friends wonder where you got all this amazing aviation information, and you can say you can watch it too. You can go to YouTube to the twit.tv channel, or you can listen to it on your computer, download it as a podcast through iTunes. You can also go to, I believe it's twit.tv/house. I believe.
MH.
I get this wrong. I got this wrong last week too, didn't I? Yes. twit.t/MH to listen to it directly from the twit.tv website. I'm Dr. Kiki. This has been episode 70 of Maxwell's House. Over and out.